Welcome back to my series on chess opening theory. In this video, I'm going to be looking at the exchange variation in the French defense. So the French defense is when we have the moves e4, e6, d4, d5. And the exchange variation is when white now plays a move bishop to d3 and... Wait a minute. What's going on here? That's not right. Well, I need to check my notes. 1 second. Go to commercial. Go to commercial. Okay. Think I've got everything right now. Alright, so the exchange variation is when white plays e takes d5 and black plays e takes d5. And then here, a very common move that white might play is the move bishop to d3. And black can now argue that this bishop is very poorly placed by playing the move pawn to c5. And here it doesn't matter too much if white decides to take the pawn right away, as very often white would then continue with knight f3, black would play knight f6 next, and we would have a game like in the previous video. So white will very often play knight f3, black will play knight f6. And so previously we looked at the position where white plays d takes c5, but it is much more common for white to now castle kingside. But that's not what happened in the game. Or is it? No, instead what happened in the game was white played e4, black played e6, white played d4, black played d5. And then white played bishop to d3, hoping that black might play pawn takes d4, bishop takes e4, black plays knight f6, and white plays bishop f3, and then white would have some crazy, really weird position where white probably knows what's going on and black doesn't. That's probably what white was hoping for. But instead, black doesn't have to play into that kind of position. Black can instead try to shift the position more to something where they're familiar with what's going on. And so instead, black played the move pawn to c5, which is a very cool way of dealing with this sideline. As by playing c5, black basically threatens the pawn on d4. For example, if white plays the move pawn e5, black just takes this pawn for free. If white plays knight d2, black can just take this pawn for free. And if white takes this pawn on c5, then black can take this pawn, and white really should not take this pawn, because then white loses their castling rights. And this position is just quite good for black. Black can play for a win here. And if instead white tries dealing with that queen trade issue by giving this check, black can play bishop to d7, and now this bishop is under attack, and white really doesn't want to be trading this bishop for this bishop over here, because this bishop has moved twice, whereas this bishop has moved once, and white has to deal with the fact that this pawn is also under attack, and black can probably actually defend this pawn later, maybe by playing f5 or knight f6, that kind of stuff. And the engine already gives black a very decent edge in this position. So back in this position, by far the most popular choice for white is to play pawn takes d5, and black replies with pawn takes d5, and we now have an exchange French. One thing that I'm just going to very briefly mention before continuing is that if white does play the move knight to f3, which is a very rare move, then I personally do not like this idea of black playing pawn to c4, white playing bishop to e2, and then black taking this pawn, because even though it looks like black might have won a pawn, white can play knight e5, and both of these pawns are quite weak, and white is quite ahead in development. And even though the engine says the position is close to equal, it's only really close to equal if black plays accurately. And And I really don't like what's happening here. This just looks like a mess for black to clean up. So instead, if white were to go for this knight to f3 idea, instead of playing pawn to c4, black can instead go for pawn takes e4. And after bishop takes e4, but black can play knight to f6. And now the bishop cannot go back to f3 because the knight is there, and this pawn on d4 is once again under attack. So if the bishop goes back to d3, then black can just take the pawn for free. But that's not what happened in the game. Thought I should I thought it would be cool just to talk about this sideline for a bit, as it makes the exchange variation much more interesting to see how you can get to it from other variations. And so anyway, white took on d5, black took back. White then played knight f3, black played knight f6, and then white castled kingside. And so before continuing, I'm just going to introduce the players. With the white pieces, we have Grandmaster Robert Fontaine, who is a Grandmaster originally from France, but who now plays for Switzerland. And he is also a chess journalist. And with the black pieces, we have Grandmaster Magnus Carlsen, who has won a number of prestigious events, including the Norwegian Chess Championship, as well as the World Championship, starting in 2013 up to and including 2021. To be completely dishonest, I have never heard of Magnus Carlsen, and neither have you. More seriously, he is one of the greatest chess players of all time, and he is a very strong universalist. Like, he can play just about any kind of position, but he is especially strong in his endgame technique, and he is known for the Magnus grind, which is when Grandmaster Carlsen is playing another Grandmaster and they get into an endgame that objectively might be equal, but since Grandmaster Carlsen is very strong at endgames, he notices all these little nuances, all the little intricacies of the endgame, and his opponent makes, they both make several moves, and his opponent just makes one tiny little slip up, one tiny little inaccuracy, and then Grandmaster Carlsen just pounces on that and wins the game. So he is known for that. But we're not going to see too much of that in this game, as this was a rapid game, so the players had significantly less time to think about their moves than usual. And this particular game was played at the Pro Chess League in 2018, and more information about the players and the event can be found in the video description. Now back to the game. So in this position, black now plays the move pawn to c4, basically trying to create some chaos, trying to make this bishop go move again. And so white now plays rook e1 check, improving the position of their rook with tempo. Black plays bishop to e7, and this is a fine place for this bishop to be going, as on d6 it might be blocking the defense of the pawn on d5, from the queen, so e7 is by no means a bad square for this bishop to go. And normally white puts their bishop on f1, but in this particular game, white put their bishop on e2, probably trying to make the pieces as symmetric as possible, as white would be very happy with a draw in this game, whereas black would not be happy with a draw. If bishop f1, then the game would probably actually play out in a very similar way. Bishop going back to e2 was probably just to deal with any potential pins, with bishop coming to g4, pinning the knight to the queen. One thing I don't like about bishop e2, of course, is just that it blocks the rook. But anyway, black now castled kingside. White now played pawn to b3. And probably the last bit of opening theory that you should probably worry about when it comes to this line is just the knowledge that the point of this pawn push to c4, it wasn't really to be putting the pawn on c4 and keeping it there. It was more just to be causing some chaos in the position. So if black tries to keep this pawn here with the move pawn to b5, that would not work. That would not be a good idea. White would play pawn to a4, and if black tries playing pawn to a6, then whoops, this is no. Do not do this. This is thankfully not what happened in the game. Instead, black just took the pawn on b3, and now white has a choice in how to take back. If white were to take back with the c pawn, then the position does look a bit symmetric. The knights are symmetric, the bishops are symmetric, the rooks are almost symmetric. This rook only has one good square to go to. The queens and the other pieces are symmetric. But the fact that there are now dark square weaknesses in white's queen side are an imbalance that black could be making use of. And also, white would be taking on an isolated pawn themselves, making it less likely for the game to end in a draw. But this is not what happened in the game. Instead, white took back with the a pawn, which is much more intuitive, as this opens up the a file for the rook. The rook is quite happy to now be active, to now be participating. White has essentially developed their rook by moving a pawn. And so anyway, even though white does get this open file, this does still introduce imbalance into the position, and that is what black wants. Black plays knight to c6, and here white probably does not want to play knight to c3, as the c3 square is pretty weak. Black could maybe try playing bishop to b4, or maybe playing bishop to f5, knight b4, and going after the pawn on c2. So as a result, white decides, I'm not going to be developing my knight to c3. White instead plays pawn to c3. Black plays rook to e8, as this is really the only good square that the rook could be going to. Not only that, but black might want to overprotect this bishop, as this bishop might get attacked in the future, like by white's rook. And generally, it's a good idea to overprotect your pieces, as that can keep them a bit flexible, keep them less weak, or rather keep the pieces protecting them more flexible, I should say. I kind of misspoke there. So that they're not tied down, they're not restricted, they're not completely occupied, just defending one of the weaknesses in your position. Anyway, white now played knight bd2. Ooh, and white is probably trying to play knight to e5 and then bring the other knight to f3. This knight would be very strong on e5, so black now plays bishop to d6, defending the e5 square, and white now played bishop to d3, which is an okay move, although an issue with it is the bishop is no longer on this diagonal, so black can now pin the knight to the queen. And here white decides to trade rooks, as white would like to just trade everything off and draw the game potentially if possible. Although, against this particular opponent that might not be possible. So anyway, white now play the move knight to f1, probably trying to improve the position of their knight, trying to bring it over to the king side maybe, or maybe put it in the center. Something like that. We never do actually find out. Black now plays knight to e4, taking advantage of the fact that the knight left the d2 square. White really does not want to take this knight right now, as that would, at the very least, result in white's pawn structure on the king side having to get damaged. And so instead of taking this knight, white has to deal with the fact that the pawn on c3 is under attack. So white plays bishop to b2, and black again takes advantage of the fact that a piece has moved and is no longer defending squares that it was covering before. Black plays bishop to f4, improving the position of their own bishop, and maybe doing something very nasty on the king side here. White brings their bishop back to e2, trying to break this pin, and maybe getting a bit scared, as black is looking at the king side with some nasty intentions. Black plays queen to e6, developing their queen, maybe getting ready to bring the queen over and attack stuff on the king side. White plays pawn to b4, and white might be trying to maybe push this pawn down the board, go after the pawn on a7, something like that. But this is kind of slow, and also it further makes this bishop look even sillier, as where can this bishop really go? Oh, with this bishop, I kind of feel it'd be more comfortable if white played like pawn to c4 or something like that. Also trying to undermine this knight over here, things of that nature. It might not be possible. It might not even be a good move, but pawn to b4 does look a bit strange to me. But this is a rapid game, so I should give the players a break for any inaccuracies they make. Black plays knight to e7, kind of stepping out of the pawn to b5, coming with tempo, but more importantly, getting ready to put the knight on the king side. I'd maybe do something very, very nasty here. And white now played the move knight to g5. I'm basically bailing out and trading, forcing the exchange of a lot of pieces. And if you want, you can now pause the video and just try to figure out what exactly is it that black should take in this position, as there are quite a few things that black can take. Black can take this knight, black can take this bishop, black can take this pawn, black can take this pawn, black can take this pawn. So if you want, you can pause the video and try to figure out the best way for black to proceed. There's actually more than one correct answer here. I will reveal the move in 3, 2, 1. So in the game, black decided to play bishop takes h2 check. A desperado. As black realizes that this bishop is eventually going to be captured. Reason why is if black were to start with bishop takes e2, which is another good answer. In fact, I actually prefer bishop takes e2. Then white takes like this. White takes black's queen. Black takes white's queen. White takes black's bishop. And material is now completely equal. But I quite like black's bishop. Like the engine prefers for it to come to b3. As white's position is filled with a bunch of light square weaknesses, and the bishop can make use of those. The bishop is very free to roam around and restrict white's pieces from moving, do all that kind of good stuff. A reason why black might not have gone for this is just because it does result in opposite colored bishops, but opposite colored bishops are not necessarily a draw. They're only really a draw if all the other pieces have been traded off the board. But when there are other pieces on the board, opposite colored bishops, they very often favor the attacking player, since you have a piece that can be used to attack things that your opponent's piece cannot defend. But anyway, this is not what happened in the game. Instead, back in this position, black played the move bishop takes h2 with check, and white took back with the knight, as the knight is a bit awkwardly placed on f1, so this does kind of improve it a little bit. Black played bishop takes e2, and white took the queen. Black took white's queen, and now here white played a desperado of their own, taking this pawn over here, as white realizes that this knight is going to be captured. And here black decided to take the knight. White took the bishop, and so there are no opposite colored bishops. And there are still a fair number of imbalances on the board. We have knight versus bishop, and white's position has, all these sort of light square weaknesses that black might be able to make use of, especially given that white does not have a light square bishop that can defend them. So in this position, black played the move rook to c8, developing the rook with tempo, hitting this pawn. One benefit of black doing all these trades and trading the bishop for the knight is that it did result in this rook coming to d1, so it's no longer on a1, where it was putting pressure on this pawn. White plays rook to d3, defending this pawn and trying to activate their rook. I do like this idea, as generally in endgames, piece activity is often just as important as material. Or like I've even seen positions where one side was actually down a couple of pawns, but since they had one passed pawn that was pushed very far and their pieces were very active while their opponent's pieces were kind of out of the game, the side that was down material was actually winning the game. Anyway, black played knight to f5 in this position, just improving the position of this knight. White plays knight to f1, getting ready to maybe rotate this knight around, maybe try to trade it. Black plays pawn to h5, stopping pawn from coming to g4, stuff like that. White plays pawn to f3. Black plays knight d6. White plays pawn to g4. White is actually pretty happy to trade pawns, as it's much harder for black to promote a pawn if there are less pawns on the board. So takes. Black plays knight to e7. And here white plays knight to e3. The engine doesn't like this. The engine prefers knight g3. But I'm not going to get too in-depth with this endgame, as endgame theory is it's a very interesting, very complicated subject in itself, and this series is mainly just about opening theory. Maybe at some point I'll do a series on endgames. Anyway, in this position, black played an idea that's pretty interesting. And like the engine prefers for black to play knight to e4, but clearly the engine is making an inaccuracy. Black instead played the move knight to c4. Like, you can test how strong an engine is by putting in moves by Magnus Carlsen and counting how many inaccuracies the engine makes in evaluating Grandmaster Carlsen's moves. That's a joke, by the way. Anyway, like, this is a fine idea. Yeah, I don't hate this move, especially since it's rapid and black is trying to just make things complicated. White takes, black takes, and even though black can no longer make use of the c4 square, black can instead make use of the d5 square, where the knight would be pretty active, pretty well placed. White plays rook to f3. The engine prefers rook to e3 because of basically if black replies with knight d5, white could go rook to e5, and then the engine would not have knight to e3, whereas in this case, it's like something like that. Black could do that and be pretty happy with this very annoying knight, which might come here, harass this bishop a bit, maybe the rook comes in, stuff like that. So I think that's why the engine prefers for white to play rook e3 instead of rook f3. But anyway, black plays knight d5 anyway. White plays bishop to c1. Black plays rook to c6. The engine prefers rook e8, but the engine is obviously making an inaccuracy. So white plays bishop d2. Black plays rook to f6. It turns out that if white were to trade rooks, then this would actually be a completely winning endgame for black, as black can just push this pawn and then push the pawn to a5, and this bishop actually has a fair amount of trouble stopping the a pawn from running up the board, as these two friends are in the way. But that's not what happened in the game. Instead, white refused the trade. Black put the rook on g6, attacking this guy over here. White tries to stay active, playing rook h5, hitting this knight. Black does not take this pawn right away, as black sees a bit far ahead and sees ways that they can keep the king a bit passive. So white now plays rook a5, and black plays knight to e4, hitting this bishop and hitting this pawn, so the bishop is kind of tied down to it. We have bishop to e1. Black plays rook takes g4 check, And notice that since the knight is covering the f2 square, white cannot play king f2. White instead has to go for king f1. And obviously h1 and h2 are bad because the rook would just be completely cutting the king out of the game. So white plays king f1. Black plays pawn to a6, saving their a pawn. White plays rook to e5. And here, let's see. Here, black really needs to play the move pawn to b5, but neither player noticed this idea that's coming up as this is rapid. Instead, black played the move knight to f6. And here, if white had played the move pawn to b5, then white might have been able to save this game and get a draw, as this would probably lead to a pawn trade and the rook hitting the pawn on b7, which cannot be defended too easily. And if black tries just avoiding the trade with the move like pawn to a5, then the rook can come to c5 and win this pawn over here. And basically, the more pawns that white can trade off or get rid of, the better. The better and more easier it's going to be to deal with this passed pawn. But that's not what happened in the game. Both players missed that idea. Instead, white played the move rook to e7. Black played the move rook f4 with check. White plays king g2. Black plays rook to e4, essentially forcing a rook trade. We have the trade. King comes up to f3. Knight drops back to d6. King comes up to f4. White is activating their king. This is good, although black is up a pawn. So black plays king to f6, activating their own king. White plays pawn to d5. Black plays king to e7. White plays bishop to h4 check. The engine doesn't like this move. I don't really know why, but this series is not going to focus too much on the intricacies of the endgame. Black plays pawn to f6. Bishop goes back to f2. Knight goes to b5. Like maybe bishop to h4, maybe it wasted time because pawn to f6 might have been a move that black's happy to make anyway, as passed pawns should be pushed. Anyway, in this position, the knight is hitting the pawn on c3, and if white were to play bishop to d4, then black is very happy to make this trade, as this king and pawn endgame is completely winning. Like if white tries holding onto these pawns, black just throws this pawn out the window. Oh, and if white takes, black just, we basically just have this. And the table bases, in fact, just announced that this is just completely losing, but it's not that hard to see why. Black will just take this pawn, and then, we have 3 pawns versus 1 pawn over there. So instead, in this position, white decided to defend their pawn with the move bishop to e1, a very human move, especially since this is rapid. Black plays king to d6, going after this pawn. White plays king to e4. Black plays pawn to b6, and basically making a slight improvement to their position. White plays bishop g3 check. Black plays king to d7. White plays pawn to d6. And black just takes this pawn. White plays king to d4, which might have just been a blunder in time trouble or something, as black plays knight to e2 with check, ending the game, as this bishop is now going to be taken on the next move. So, as usual, I hope that you enjoyed the game. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and bye for now.